Actually, give me 1 second, still loading. Okay, go.
Hello, I'm Clark Sorensen. I'm going to be your moderator this evening. We have a presentation of a new book that's just come out. It's a conference volume called Peace Corps Volunteers and the Making of Korean Studies in the United States. It's published by the Center for Korea Studies at the University of Washington and distributed by the University of Washington Press. We have as our panelists today and Ambassador Kathleen Stevens and four of the contributors, chapter contributors to the book. This book originated at a conference held in 2016 at Indiana University at the Institute for Korea Studies, called Peace Corps Volunteers and the Making of Korean Studies in the United States. The conference was especially apt because it was the 55th anniversary of the founding of the Peace Corps and the 50th anniversary of the arrival of Peace Corps volunteers in Korea. So returned volunteers from this program went on into academia to become founders of the second generation of Korea Studies scholars. Many of the people of that generation either have retired or are about to retire. So it seemed like a timely point to address, kind of look back and see what the impact of these scholars has been on the Korea Studies field. So that's the premise of the conference. The volume itself and the conference was organized by Seung-Jung Kim, who's the director of the Institute for Korea Studies at Indiana University. And the book is co-edited by her and Michael Robinson. He's professor emeritus of Korean history from Indiana University as well. The conference had a lot of support. The original conference was supported by the Academy for Korean Studies. Then the publication of the book was supported by the University of Washington Center for Korea Studies that has a series that we use to publish conference proceedings, also by the Indiana University Institute for Korea Studies, by the Korea Economic Institute, KEI, and by the Friends of Korea. So this conference and the subsequent publication was sponsored by all of these institutions, and we're very grateful for the support that they gave us. People can also purchase the book through University of Washington Press, and I'm going to briefly share the screen so you can see the UW Press site. So, no, maybe not. I don't see it. Just a minute. Okay, here we go. Well, maybe I'm not going to share the screen because I have so many windows open that I can't find the right one. So let's go back. Are we still here? I've lost everything. Good, I thought I was a pro at this because I've been teaching Zoom courses for a long time, but somehow it's not working out. Let me try one more time. No, it doesn't want to come up. So I'll skip that then. But anyway, you can buy the book through the University of Washington Press. And all of you that have signed up for this webinar get a discount. So if you go to the University of Washington Press site, if you click on Asian Studies, And then once you get to the Asian Studies page, if you click on publications of the Center for Korean Studies, the book should come up and you can order it at the discount. That's a 30% discount that all of the attendees of this webinar get. So without further ado, I want to start introducing our panelists. First person I want to introduce is the very distinguished Kathleen Stevens. I can't possibly summarize her whole career, which would take me 10 minutes to do. So I'll just hit a few highlights. She is leader of the KEI as president and has been CEO since 2018. She was a career diplomat in the United States Foreign Service from 1978 to 2015. She was US ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011. And this made her both the first woman ambassador and the first Korean speaker to serve in that position. And she had many other overseas assignments. She's had lots of important policy positions in Washington. But Korea has been an important leitmotif of Ambassador Stevens' life and career since she served in the Peace Corps as a volunteer and trainer in 1975 to 1977. So that means she overlapped with my fieldwork in Korea, Laurel Kendall's fieldwork in Korea, and maybe others as well, although I never met her at that time. She's had lots and lots of other distinguished chairs. So I'll leave it at that. You get the idea. I couldn't possibly summarize everything. So please, Ambassador Stevens, say a few remarks for us for the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Professor Sorensen, Clark. That was a very nice introduction. And I feel very honored to be part of this group. I have thoroughly enjoyed this project, although I am not a scholar, I'm not a Korean studies scholar, but I consider myself a beneficiary of the work of many of the scholars here on this panel tonight and in the audience online. And I actually have a copy of the book, so I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way and show it here. Because I was asked to write the afterword, which means I got to read all the chapters early on. And, you know, and I guess the thing about Korea, maybe the thing about life is, you know, whenever you think you know something and then you read something else, you realize how much you don't know or didn't know, but, you know, should have known at the time or should have done, 했더라면, you know, but so this is a great book if you're a former Peace Corps volunteer, but also I think it really is so revealing of some of the underpinning of the understanding and the growth of Korean studies in the United States and indeed elsewhere. So I think I was asked, and I said I wouldn't talk too long because we have a panel here, but I was asked to talk about my Peace Corps experience and why it was important to me. So that would take, you know, like many days. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to do what we do as I am a former Peace Corps volunteer, as you said. I was there from 1975 to 1977. I was K35. So I think our speakers tonight are mostly my sunbae. So in good Korean style, I need to defer to them. But as I did then, and Clark, maybe we met, but you just don't remember me. But in all seriousness, I'm trying to be, you know, Peace Corps is a very sticky experience in life, if you like. I think it's something that really does shape your life whatever you do afterwards and wherever you serve. And Korea is a pretty sticky place too. And the combination, I think, just says, and we'll hear it in the stories tonight, and certainly in my own story. Yeah, more than a leitmotif, it is a defining experience that continues to kind of redefine itself. And, you know, in Korea itself, I mean, why are we so interested in Korean studies? This is just darn interesting, complex, infuriating, wonderful place. And, you know, what I found, just to say, I so I had this long career. We're all old. We all have had long careers doing something. And most of my career did not have anything to do with Korea. But when I went as ambassador, to everybody's surprise, I'd say, including my own, in 2008, so there'd never been a woman to serve before there. It never really honestly occurred, I think, in any serious way that it would be useful to have an ambassador who spoke Korean, maybe bad Korean, but nonetheless Korean, and had some immersion in Korean culture and history to be ambassador. But when I went, I discovered with Koreans, and this won't surprise the many who are here, including on the panel who know Korea well, this was my defining characteristic. It actually was not so much that I was a woman, or it wasn't even so much the fact I spent 6 years in Korea in the 1980s as a political officer at the American Embassy covering Korea's dramatic political transformation. It's a very deep experience for me as well. But what they knew about me and how, first of all, they knew my Korean name. And even now when I go back to Korea, they know my Korean name, which was given to me by my Peace Corps Korean language teacher. And secondly, they knew where I served. They knew that I'd served in Chungnam, Yesan. And people would come up and they wanted to tell me where they were from because they knew where I was from. So, the power of this has, in my own life, if you like, and in my own identity, has only continued to grow. But one of the really enriching things I think about the past decades, but especially the past few years, is to, as you suggested, Clark, to get to a period where we kind of reflect on how, in the United States, I mean, the relationship has changed so much. I've been involved in the official relationship, but in so many ways, and I won't try to enumerate them, we'll get into some of them. The connections between our two countries, the way we work together on things, the way we see the world is all transformed beyond, what I think any of us could have imagined back in the 60s or the 70s. And I think that this book and this bringing together of scholars who did come back to the United States. And I came back, because of my story, while I was in Korea, I took the Foreign Service exam because I figured that taking an exam was something Koreans could sort of relate to. So I would sit in my gyomushil where I was teaching in a middle school and read novels and say I'm studying for the diplomatic exam, and that gave me some standing as a 21-year-old foreign woman with no particular qualifications. But I was told I had to pass the exam or I would never come back to that school again. But anyway, I did not go into Korean studies, but over the years, I have followed and benefited from the blossoming of Korean studies in the United States, from the work of many of the scholars represented in this book and their students, and indeed their professors. So the last thing I want to say, I wasn't going to talk so long, and then I did, is I know I have many people I'd like to kind of acknowledge on this panel and in our audience today, because we have a tremendous audience from all over the world here. But I'm not going to do that because there's so many. But we did get an email from a K30 whom I didn't know. Her name was Edith Jensen, who's in Sweden, and she wrote and she said, "It's way too late for me to join this in Sweden. I can't do it. But my professor, Dr. Felix Moos from the University of Kansas, a professor emeritus, was the one who told me I should go to Korea and be in the Peace Corps." And so she wanted me, this is a very Korean thing to do to pay respect to her professor, Professor Moos, who I understand is with us tonight, and to remind us too that there was Korean studies even before the Peace Corps. And I think that everyone here today is part of a tradition and a line of scholars that I think will only continue to enrich not only our own lives, but the understanding and the work between our two peoples and our two countries. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but I really look forward to the discussion tonight. I recommend the book to everybody very highly.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Stevens. We'll go right on to the rest of our panelists. The next three panelists are all former Peace Corps volunteers who were contributors to the volume. I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Don Baker, who served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Gwangju, South Cholla Province from 1971 to 1974. He got his PhD at the University of Washington and is now professor of Korean civilization in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. So go ahead, Don.
Okay, I got 5 minutes, right? Okay.
Right, 5 minutes. I'm going to time you.
Okay. I'll start off by saying I went to Korea kind of by accident. I was interested in China, and I graduated from university and wanted to go to Taiwan to improve my Chinese. and didn't have any money. So I thought I'd go to Korea, and Peace Corps would teach me how to teach English. Then I'd move to Taiwan. Well, once I got to Korea, forget that. I fell in love with Korea. The food in Gwangju helped. It's delicious food. And so I was in Gwangju from 71 to 74 as a Peace Corps volunteer. And that's what made my decision to become a Korean historian, because I was fascinated by the culture there and wanted to know how these Koreans managed to maintain their cultural and political autonomy for so many centuries. It's quite amazing. But it wasn't just an intellectual connection to Korea. I lived with a Korean family in Gwangju, and they became like another family, so much so that 20 years after I finished my Peace Corps service in 1995, I was in Japan, and I heard from the nephew of my landlady in Gwangju that she was dying of cancer. So I got on a plane in Japan and flew to Gwangju, and I went to her house. She opened the door and said, "My American son has returned."
Wow.
So you really become a part of the family. And I'm still, that nephew of hers, I still go to Korea, and he calls me big brother, and I call him little brother. You know, we're still friends after 50 years. And so there's a personal connection with the Korean people that you get from Peace Corps that becomes a part of your life forever. And so Gwangju is the city I was in from 71 to 74. I'd gone to University of Washington, as you heard, to work on my PhD. Had returned to Korea in 79 to do dissertation research in Seoul. And then I heard in May 1980 what was going on down in Gwangju. And not as an historian, but as somebody who cared for the people in Gwangju, I went and smuggled myself into the city and saw what is happening there in May 1980. And that changed my life forever. As a historian, I'm lucky, I tell people, because I've been able to witness not only a very important event in modern Korean history, the Gwangju massacre, but I also been able to witness Korea was poor in 1971. It was poor and under dictatorial rule. Now it's democratic and prosperous. And as an historian, to watch that transformation in my lifetime is incredible. Of course, my students don't believe me. I show them pictures of what it was like when I was in Peace Corps, my Korean Canadians. They say, "No, it wasn't like that ever." I say, "Yes, I really had to walk down the street to take a bath." You know, they don't believe me. The only Korea they know is a prosperous and democratic Korea. But as an historian, to have been able to personally witness that, I really am grateful to Peace Corps for that. But I'm also grateful the Peace Corps allowing me to have this personal connection with Korea and with the people in Gwangju especially, because it's affected the way I do history, as I talk about in my contribution to the volume. I've learned, first of all, two things. I've learned that you can't trust first-person accounts because I saw some things, other people saw other things in Gwangju, you know, and we all have different viewpoints on what happened there. But also, so that got me interested in the whole concept of what happens when people witness a traumatic event and try to record what they saw. And so I actually teach a graduate seminar at the University of British Columbia on what I call the reproduction of historical trauma, looking at events in the 20th century, starting with Gwangju, but looking at the bombing of Hiroshima, the Cultural Revolution in China, and so on, and how these events are reproduced in different ways through people's different memories, but also in fiction and film. If Peace Corps had not sent me to Gwangju in 1971, I would never have become a Korean historian. I would never have been so lucky as to see this incredible transformation of Korea in my lifetime. And I never would have realized how important it is to see how people tell their stories and how different they can be, even from eyewitnesses. It's made me a much more careful historian. So I'm forever grateful to what Peace Corps has done for me.
That sounds great, Don. You're exactly on 5 minutes, so a very disciplined performance here. We'll move on in alphabetical order now to Laurel Kendall. Laurel is chair of the anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History and of Asian ethnographic collections. She's author of many books on Korea and past president of the Association for Asian Studies and a former Peace Corps volunteer. I'll let you speak for yourself on that, Laurel. So go ahead. I can't hear you.
Thanks, Clark. I was a K-11. I arrived in Korea on a very cold January day in 1970. Like Don, I thought I was going to be, that China would be my focus. In my case, I knew I was going to be an anthropologist. I thought I was going to go to Taiwan and get the little Chinese I had already studied in shape. And I didn't have money, and Peace Corps would send me to Korea, and I'd wait out the 2 years, and other stuff happened. When I got the call for this for the conference that became the volume, I thought, now this is going to be a celebratory event. And I could write a very celebratory piece, but instead I wrote something else. I wrote something called, Did Women Have a Korea Peace Corps Experience? And I wanted the readers to understand that being a single woman in Korea was very different from being a single man in Korea, and that there were reasons having to do with American social history at that time and the American-Korean relationship at that time. But tonight, I think we should be celebratory, and I'm going to give you a presentation, the gist of which is the paper I might have written if I weren't sowing mischief. Okay, so before I went to Korea, knowing I wanted to be an anthropologist, pulling through the reading, trying to find something that would interest me, something I could latch onto. And in a Korean government publication that I think we were all issued, there was one line about traditional ritual mask dramas are being revived. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to look for the traditional mask dance dramas that are being revived, because I knew from my anthropology background that ritual drama was a very cool thing. I had looked at it in some other places secondhand through reading. So I went to Korea, and it was not so easy to find the traditional mask dance dramas in 1970. I remember one day standing in the Bando Chosun arcade, this kind of creaky shopping mall between, attached to the Chosun Hotel, and seeing a display of masks made out of gourds, these beautiful cartoon-like faces. And I bought. I didn't have much money. It was a big expenditure, $10 for this white mask, the face of the Somo, the white seductive woman's face. Never dreaming as I stood there that I would get to know the mask maker, that in fact my parents would meet the mask maker, and that I would have a Korean sister who wore that mask, incarnated that character for many years as part of a heritage performance troupe. I didn't know those things. I went and saw a performance in one of the palaces, and it was still just in the audience. Now, how do I get to know these people? And then I got lucky, incredibly lucky, through a bunch of coincidences. I got the right introduction. Everything in Korea hangs on the right introduction. Somebody introduced me to Dr. Lee Do-hyun, and he was the go-to guy for mask dance drama. He was studying it. He was encouraging the revival. He was lobbying the government for support for the troops. And he saw me as an ally, because there was a lot of feeling still in 1970 that traditional Korean culture was being done out by Western music, by Western movies, by Western culture, and it was all going to fade away if people didn't make an effort. And he said, all right, if people put the West on a pedestal, let's encourage the Westerners to come and get excited about Korean things. And he introduced me to the group that danced Bongsan Talchum, the masked dances of Bongsan, these guys. And we had an arrangement where I would teach them English and they would teach me to dance. And I'm a terrible dancer and nobody really got much English, but we had a wonderful time together. And they knew shamans, and we went to Kut, and we went mountain climbing, and we went drinking makgeolli, and we went to a lot of performances. And they were passionate, fun, eccentric people. They were the people I really wanted to meet and connect with. And that set me on my path. This was the Korea that excites me, that interests me, that I really want to study. Now, 50 years later, looking back on the 70s and looking back on how in Korean studies we think of folklore revival, everybody knows that in the 1980s, mask dance, shaman rituals, these things came to be thought of as the arts of the Minjung, and they had a political content, and people, broadly embraced them as parts of Korean culture. There is a general acknowledgement that 1988 Olympics was a moment when certain folk handicrafts that were vanishing, were brought forward and designated as important cultural objects. Ongi jars, for example, which nobody needed anymore because they had refrigerators and they didn't need to bury their kimchi. But the jars were all used as trash receptacles at the Olympics. And suddenly there was a certain idealization of ongi. And eventually now there are intangible heritage bearers in ongi pottery, and their pots go for thousands and thousands of dollars. Little bamboo combs were kind of saved from oblivion because they were on the list of things that were treasured. But when you look back at the 70s, that was not at all certain. It was this very, very, very hesitant moment that took passion and commitment on the part of the performers, on the part of the scholars. And when I look back on that time now, 50 years later, old woman, I think, in some of my subsequent work, I need to witness. I need to do something in the manner of a memoir of those people in that time, because that's a history that's on the verge of, the history itself is on the verge of being forgotten. The stuff they tried to save has been saved, and that goes forward. But how did it happen? That we need to remember. Okay, that's enough for me.
Well, that was really an interesting contribution and quite different from your chapter in the book. So you all are going to have to read the book to get the other chapter that Laurel actually wrote. So we'll move on to Ned Schultz now. Ned Schultz is Professor Emeritus at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He came to the Peace Corps in 1966. And so you'll go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. And just to give another plug for the book, Laurel's article was really, for me, illuminating. We always knew that women had a hard time, and she really zeroed in. And I've known Don Baker for far too long, and some of the tales he tells in that article were new to me. So I really want to urge you all to go ahead. And I think just to reiterate something that both Don and Laurel pointed out, Peace Corps was really a transformative experience for all of us. And it really gave us the grounding to go into Korean studies. And I think all three of us had such a great time in Peace Corps that we returned to Korea, some as East West Center grantees, some as Fulbright grantees, some as Korean Traders Association, any number of ways we've gone back again and again. But it's really the Peace Corps that gave us the initial grounding. Peace Corps, when it started, it had three goals, and I never remember them, so I wrote them down. And one was to provide technical knowledge to the host country. And we did that. We went and we provided a kind of technical knowledge. Many of us were English teachers, some were scientists, but that was sort of what we gave. The second thing was to learn about the host country. And how could you not learn about Korea if you're there for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years? And the final thing was to return to the United States and share our knowledge and experience. And that obviously inspired a lot of us to get involved in Korean studies. And hopefully we've shared some of the knowledge and have met some of the goals of that Peace Corps, initial Peace Corps challenge. And as I think you can see, Peace Corps was really the foundation for Don's career, Laurel's career, my career, and many, many, many others. Like all of us, we started off with training. And training was really important in part because it sort of gave us an idea of what was out there already in Korean studies. And I think we all paid debt to the first generation of Korean scholars, but we also realized there was an awful lot of work that needed to be done. And you could basically pick a field and you could help become, if not a pioneer, certainly a major contributor. Training was also important because it taught us how to respond to new situations, how to improvise, how to get things done when you're really not quite sure what you're doing. And having been an academic for the last 50 years, I can assure you it really helped me improvise and try to figure out how to get out of some very, very tricky situations. The Peace Corps, though, another thing in which training and Peace Corps as a whole has been important is it's really given us a group friendship for really 50 years. And I'm going to mention this again in just a minute when I talk about living in Korea. And that's something that Don just mentioned, how we lived with families. We lived with Koreans, and these people became very much a part of our lives, and we were a part of their lives. And we all have our families, or many of us have our families we can go back and we can talk to. And some have even immigrated to the United States. I guess they were so impressed by my English that they decided to travel there. But anyway, it's given us friendships. It's given us sort of a place where we fit in Korea. Koreans like to peg people. They like to sort of know, well, where's your hometown? How old are you? Where'd you go to school and whatnot? And having been in Peace Corps, that immediately gave Koreans a chance to refer to us. It's Ambassador Stevens mentioned that. They didn't care about her being ambassador. They remember she was from Yesan. And that's just what happened to all of us. So when I went back to Korea on a Fulbright or an East West Center grantee, they already knew who I was because I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer. And they could peg me. And they also, I think, were more willing to accommodate me because they realized that I wasn't some just nighttime floozy coming in, but I really had a bona fide interest. And these are friendships. We talked about friendships among our volunteers, but also friendships among Koreans that we've kept up until this day. I went back for graduate school, and some of the key people who were with me as grad students have remained, again, bosom buddies right up to today. So it's really Peace Corps, though, that provided this and gave us that foundation. I was fortunate, and everybody thinks they are fortunate where they lived, but I know I was especially fortunate because I lived in Busan. And Busan has the most salubrious climate and also some great seafood, and of course, really good kimchi. Anyway, it was living in Busan, which sort of grounded me in history. Now you can say, well, Busan's kind of a new city, but Busan was very, very close to Gyeongju, about maybe 2-hour train ride to Gyeongju. And people in Busan were very interested in their past, and they constantly talked to me about how really Korea's history needed to be studied. And I was very blessed that the principal of my school told me a lot about history. He encouraged me to go and study history, and he whetted my appetite by encouraging me to go to Gyeongju. And that's where I really came into grips with what a wonderful ancient Korean culture Korea was. You were talking about how people can't believe how Korea has changed. You show them pictures when we were there, they just can't believe it. But it was an amazing, Gyeongju was an amazing little town. I don't think there was any paved road in the town, and yet you saw these beautiful mounds, tomb mounds, and yet you go there today and there's no relationship to where it was in 1967, 1966. So all of these things have been so important in building my career. And I think finally, I just want to point out that it's given me, Peace Corps gave me the confidence to go in and do strange things. Gave me the confidence to go in and meet people and ask questions. It gave me the confidence to go into those dark markets and just really see what's going on back there. And it just all these different things. It's also given, as I briefly mentioned before, it's given us a great cohort here in the United States and in Canada, I guess, because we would routinely meet every year, every other year at Association for Asian Studies conferences, other special conferences, and this sort of helped build an esprit de corps among scholars of Korea. There's a lot of other great scholars who didn't have the experience. I think Clark is one, but are very much part of our whole experience. And I think it really kind of made us into a cohort that we were going to try to change the face of how Korea was looked at. So with that, I just want to thank you all for this experience. I have no idea if I blathered on longer than I should, but it's great meeting everybody, hearing everybody, and seeing everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. We're going on now to the last two speakers, myself and Professor Moon. Both of us were kind of outside speakers. Neither of us were Peace Corps volunteers. And we were brought into the conference to comment from the outside. So I'd asked Professor Moon to turn on her audio and speak for us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me as a panel. As Professor Sorensen says, as an outsider, I do not have much more to share in this discussion. but I was one of the person who discussed with Seung Kim when she was looking for a suitable topic for inaugural conference of the new Korean Institute at Indiana. That looking into the Peace Corps contribution would be very, very meaningful endeavor. So I'm so happy to see this volume and to participate in that interesting conference. And also later I started working at the Academy of Korean Studies, which is doing a lot of things to support Korean studies abroad in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia. So by relating these two, probably I can say a few things to say. First, although I'm not directly involved with decision making, I'm still curious about those Peace Corps volunteers who became Korean studies scholars after completing their service in 60s and 70s, but had to leave, had to abandon for various reasons, Korean studies altogether. I think it's Charles Goldberg is one of them, and which is really pity. It was such an important period in the formation of Korean studies. This departure was such a great loss. So maybe probably if you could hear what had been the background of their abandonment or whatever you say, probably knowing that would be helpful in the future support or collaboration between Korea and United States. The second thing is also, I mentioned in my chapter, that I was impressed reading the chapters that on-site experience, as all of you mentioned here, of the paper had been so precious, not only for anthropologists, but also scholars of other fields. Many authors have so candidly commented upon the ways how their face-to-face encounter with the people in their lives through the Peace Corps service has influenced them intellectually and empathy-wise. And in this connection, some might object, but it is in a sense unfortunate that the experience of 1960s and 70s had some long-lasting negative imprints in dealing with their research subject. If you see Koreans as a research subject, as Clark Sorensen mentioned, it may be critical engagement with sympathetic orientation, he said, but this critical engagement, from my own experience, has been expressed in somewhat hostile attitudes. I hate to say this, but like Professor James Barley, who taught many ex-Peace Corps members at UW, always rejected any invitation from AKS because it was an institution created by Park Jung-hee. I will never go to AKS. Also, the AKS members who wanted to become a visiting scholar at Harvard Yenching, Ed Baker always say, no, you can never come unless you change your name from Hanguk Jeongsin Muna Yeonguwon, because it reminds all those Park Jung-hee eras and everything. Finally, he accepted that we changed the name in 2005 to Hangukak Jeongsinmun, Hangukak Jungangyeongguwon. So these things continue, that they're negative impressions and that creates something, or Korean government, Korean establishment in general are very bad thing, evil thing. It seems to me, so such an attitude has not always mutually beneficial. It has not been beneficial in terms of collaboration and dialogue among those engaged in Korean studies in both countries. And I must say, I mean, this is, Clark Sorensen also mentions, it may be Koreans were frustrated because they had longed for frankly and critical admiration of Korean culture and history among Americans. Or some people just say that Koreans, academia or otherwise, are so hopelessly nationalistic. They are so they look for admiration. I don't think so, but this experience has some impact on their representation or on their understanding of Korea. I mean, that's my impression. So as many of you already mentioned, South Korea has undergone a lot of transformations in not only in terms of relative prosperity, but also overall political landscape. As majority of those who had been active in the opposition in the 60s through the 1980s have been in the power by winning several elections. Nevertheless, although I do not know how observers from outside feel about the current affairs, many of us living in South Korea nowadays, I mean, we were all university students, we felt very similar ways that all the Peace Corps members were there. But we are rather perplexed whether the virtues of democracy and freedom are really being realized by these opposition leaders coming into power. And also the dualistic perspective of good and evil that seems to have been prevailed among many Peace Corps members is applicable in the contemporary situation. I'm not trying to delve into any political debate or anything or any complex question of representation, but because Korea has changed so much, politically, socially, and culturally and everything, I just wondered how your impressions of the 60s and 70s and the present day Korea, how it affects how you feel about this. That's my curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moon. And I guess I get to sum up. I was brought to the conference not because I was in the Peace Corps, but because I was never in the Peace Corps. And for our generation in Korean studies, that's quite unusual, since most of the people in our age group went through the Peace Corps. So I kind of did a think piece trying to figure out how did the Peace Corps figure in the development of Korean studies? Did it change it? And I wondered whether the Peace Corps experience itself shaped Korean studies. So my paper was called Cultural Immersion, Imperialism, and the Academy. Cultural immersion, because one of the purposes of the Peace Corps was to send impressionable young Americans abroad to a place where they'd have to sink or swim and they would get to know foreign cultures very well. Imperialism, because it looks to me from the long view that the Peace Corps was part and parcel of the US expansion after World War II into a lot of the world. And that expansion, I think, included three institutions that are closely related. One was the Fulbright exchange program, which was started in 1947. Then there was the National Defense Education Act in 1958, which was a reaction to the moral panic when Sputnik went up into the air before a US satellite did. And this funded a lot of foreign language education, especially in more exotic languages. And then finally, the Peace Corps itself, where people were sent abroad, both to create goodwill by selflessly dedicating themselves to the betterment of the countries where they were sent, but also to learn about these countries. So I thought that the fact that the second generation of Korea Studies scholars largely went through this Peace Corps experience was significant, but it's significant in complex ways. One was that the 1960s was a time of social ferment in the United States, as well in South Korea, so that the people who went into the Peace Corps were concerned about things that were happening around the world or happening to themselves. And depending upon which age cohort you were in, whether you were going to be drafted into the Vietnam War or not during this period. And so there were a lot of political concerns and confrontation that went on. The baby boomer generation confronted both the Vietnam War and stagflation. So there was that going into it. And yes, I did say, as Professor Moon mentioned, that I thought that the attitude of those who came out of the Peace Corps was one of critical engagement combined with sympathetic orientation to Korean politics and culture. So my question to myself was, what was the contribution of the Peace Corps experience itself? And I concluded that even if the Peace Corps was structurally part of the Cold War, a Cold War project, the motivations of the individual Peace Corps volunteers were not necessarily Cold War specific, but a lot of them were young people. They weren't quite sure what they were going to do. They were out for some adventure, and the Peace Corps provided it. Most of them, or a lot of them that I've talked to, and I interviewed a number of people before writing this paper, were not politically engaged before they got to Korea, but they became politically engaged after they got to Korea. So there were kind of two hypotheses that I explored. One was the minimal hypothesis that the Peace Corps veterans who went into academia have provided a better understanding of Koreans on the part of the American people. And I think that's a no-brainer that has happened. All of the people here have published their books on Korea. But I also asked a second, more maximal hypothesis, whether the Peace Corps experience itself was intellectually formative for the people who went through it. And if so, how that affected Korean studies. I'm not going to go into the details of this because, people went through the Peace Corps experience. A lot of them decided to go into academia, but academia has its own standards and its own winnowing process. So some people made it through, others did not. And so academia kind of selected which people they wanted. But I think that the confluence of the Peace Corps in Korea with the development of Aryan studies seems to have introduced young and impressionable men and women to Korea at a time when they wouldn't have gotten interested in Korea otherwise. So that's certainly important. But the next thing is that the Peace Corps experience itself, the 1960s and the 1970s were periods of rapid development, but they were also periods of authoritarian government that were quite shocking for a lot of the Peace Corps volunteers who went into Korea, many of whom didn't have developed political ideology until they got there. And then they had to deal with the fact that Koreans were dealing with this as well as themselves, and it made them more reflective and more critical than they would have been had they not gone through that experience. So to me, my conclusion really was that if you compare the Korea field with the China field or the Japan field, the Korea field, the scholars in the Korea field were more critical, more politically engaged in the way they dealt with Korea. And this goes across all the fields, history, anthropology, sociology, whatever. And it's because the Peace Corps experience itself was politically challenging for the volunteers who went through that experience. So that's all I'm going to really say tonight. That was kind of my summary of what it looked like from the outside of these Peace Corps volunteers. So we'd like to have a lively question and answer period. I'll check and see if we've got questions.
Can we respond to what the two of you have said?
Sure, why not?
Okay. I wanted to respond to Okyo's. I hadn't ever really thought about it, that people carry the 70s and the perception of 70s politics, longer than South Korea had carried the shadow of the 70s. And I guess I'm thinking of it somewhat differently. I think that those of us who engage with young Koreans as our students or go back to Korea frequently, that one of the things one learns, and it reflects the kind of anthropology I try to write, is that change is a constant and change is dynamic and nothing stays the way it was. And part of the reason I want to look back on and reflect on and think about the 70s is that I'm too old to deal with what's going on in Korea now. It takes agile young scholars to do all the K-pop and all the ins and outs and subtleties of the contemporary socio-political scheme. And something I had a student writing an MA on the My Life Is Not Your Porn movement, which was just heavily internet inflected. And I thought, oh, wow, this is interesting, but I can only be a spectator with this kind of dynamic, cutting edge contemporary stuff. What I can offer is a reflection back on the 70s that's clearly coded as the 70s. It's not a weird, and this is Korea, therefore forever, but this was that moment in time. And it was then, it was very different from now. Let's try and understand the then as a then. It's the same problem as, I'm always facing in the museum. People see mannequins in a glass case and they say, we're not like that now. A problem you never have in Korea, because you walk from contemporary Korea into a museum and you see the Chosun period. You walk into the American Museum of Natural History and see the Chosun period, and Koreans get very offended. We're not like that now. No, we've got to say in blazing letters, this is a room from the 19th century. And likewise, when we reflect on the 70s, we have to make it very clear that this was a 70s that isn't a 2020s.
Thank you very much, Laurel. You actually answered one of the questions that one of the people asked, that they wanted to hear some responses to Professor Moon's good points. A second question that came up, understanding the course of the massive differences between the 1960s, 70s, and today, what does poverty look like today, either urban or rural? That is, how would those of you who saw or observed the poverty in the country decades ago compare that to today? Kind of a tough question.
Let me try to reference that very, very briefly. I was there in the 60s. And so by the time you got to the 70s, things had changed a little, but not dramatically. But in the early 70s, I was out someplace in Honam, Jeollado, with some Korean graduate students. And one of my buddies turned to me and he said, look at those kids. They're healthy. They don't have mucus coming down their face anymore. And so in the 60s, you really saw little kids running around and they didn't look very healthy at all. But by the early 70s, it was already a change. And of course, it only got stronger and stronger. And so that's just something, that's interesting changes that were occurring, and we were able to see them.
Yeah, I can tell you a personal anecdote that's similar to that. I first arrived in Korea in 1976, and when I arrived in Seoul, Seoul was already pretty developed. It had a subway and lots of other modern conveniences. And I had a good friend who had been in Korea 10 years earlier, and she was in absolute shock. She said, this isn't Korea. When I was in Korea, there were ox carts going down Cheongno, not a subway. And that was just a period of 10 years. And she was completely, Korea seemed completely unfamiliar to her. So, I would ratify everything that Laurel said, is that the change has been so rapid that for Korea, you always have to specify what period you're talking about. And when I teach Korea, I tell my students, if you ever make a statement about Korea, you have to tell me what year you have in mind, because otherwise it can't possibly be a valid statement.
And could I just add to that? I think that the issue of inequality has become far more salient in the last 2 decades in Korea. In the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, even when there was tremendous economic growth, the Gini coefficient was kind of quite good, if one believes in that. And but I think there was this kind of post-Korean War egalitarianism. I mean, certainly there was still class structure and so on, but there was a sense that we're kind of all in this together in a way. And so when you ask, what does poverty look like today? It gets a little bit into, yes, someone who is in poverty in South Korea today is maybe economically very insecure, but maybe eating white rice all the time, which we didn't see when we lived in Korea back in our day. But the feeling of inequality is very strong. And that is something that I did not experience in my slice of Korea in the 1970s, the sense that there was this huge gap between the rich and the poor.
We have a comment that USC's Peace Corps Korea collection is fabulous. So those of you that are interested in that can look that up. Here's another question from Matt Van Volkenberg. Most accounts focus on the Peace Corps volunteers' dealings with Koreans. Would anybody like to comment on your relationship with the Peace Corps as an organization during your service? I've heard both positive and negative opinions on this topic.
I can say I got along well with the Peace Corps staff in Seoul, but I still remember though, when I got my assignment to Gwangju, the main Korean in the office said to me, "I'm so sorry you have to go out into the countryside." He apologized for sending me to Gwangju. And of course I loved it. Now I had no problems. The Peace Corps doctor was great. Mrs. Shim, who was in Peace Corps then, moved to Fulbright. She was wonderful. I never saw anything negative about the Peace Corps staff at all. Maybe other volunteers had other experiences, not me.
I was, as I mentioned before, in the first group, so the staff didn't know what they were doing, which was great because we could sort of do what we wanted to do. They'd come around and give us support if we needed it. But I too didn't run into any problems with staff. They were all very, very supportive, and some of them had warm houses, and they had places where you could take showers if you needed it, but nothing but positive.
And I'll say, yes, I agree. Mrs. Shim was great. I'm not going to say anything against Mrs. Shim, but I had a somewhat different view of the staff. That's in my chapter.
Yeah, and just, I can't speak from first person experience, but I have heard a lot of griping from ex-Peace Corps volunteers, particularly about the hardships of being in remote rural posts. Well, do we have any more volunteer comments? We've run out of questions.
I just want to add one thing about the K1 group. We have a Zoom every other week, in which it's on a Saturday afternoon, in which we get together and just sort of share experiences. And 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Terry Mixture show films of Korea in 1966 and 67. And I would love to see our students look at those and see, I mean, it's stark, the differences and how it's changed. And it just sort of speaks to how Peace Corps has built a great cohort, not only among the people who are there together, but it also speaks to the cohort we have here right now with Don and Laurel and many, many other scholars. And so I don't want to sound too Pollyanna, but I am in Hawaii and things are nice out here.
I wanted to go back and address the issue of poverty. I have a lot of field shots from my 1976 and 1977 field work. And I found that after the first year or two of teaching, I stopped showing pictures in my class. And the reason I stopped showing pictures is the poverty looked so abject in those pictures that I didn't feel I could show them to American students anymore. And the time that I was there, I didn't feel that way at all. That, there's poverty, which is lacking certain things, but there wasn't poverty of spirit. People were hardworking, they had fun, they had full lives. So looking at the physical rundown villages, the villages I was in, most of the houses still had grass roofs. They were made out of wattle and daub and everything, and they looked really, I guess, slummy, but that's not the reality as I understood it. And so if the physical space that you observe, poverty is a relative concept, and there's, poverty like lack of material things, and there's poverty of spirit. And what I didn't find was very much poverty of spirit, even though there was a lot of poverty in the sense of lacking material things.
I would follow up on that. I think poverty, abject poverty, things that look poor, are far less visible now, but they exist. And every now and then a social scientist will give a presentation and I'll be reminded of how, how blinded I am to the glitz on the street. But to pick up on Ambassador Stevens' comments, I'm aware of I think it's kind of a global condition, the inequalities of class and the implications of the inequalities of class, where I know people who would have been thought of as poor in the 70s, the family I did my field work with, and a couple of the children have been successful. They've married civil servants, they live in apartments, their children have had university educations. But on the basis of that education, and however hard they've worked, however bright they are, they know that it's going to be hard. They'll be lucky if they get a good job because the avenues of advancement are fairly narrow and people often feel the right degree, the right connections, the right this and that. And it's very, on that level, I think it's very similar to what we're seeing with the American middle class, or not supremely different from it. A situation where the conditions of success of real success have become so polarized, and below that rung of real success is a lot of precarity. Of maybe you succeed, maybe you don't. How easy you can lose everything. And it's a global condition, and we're ready for a global dialogue.
On that note, one of my most lively class discussions has been a discussion of the film Parasite, which of course won an Academy Award, and it's a Korean film, and it's all about class differences and all of the resentment that's involved in everything. And I asked my classes, well, this is a Korean film, but it won an Academy Award in the United States. Why do you suppose a Korean film like that got a theatrical release in the United States and was popular in the United States? Why can Koreans make a very explicit movie about class that Americans like, that Hollywood itself cannot make? And that can get a lively discussion because, as Laurel mentioned, this kind of stratification that's characteristic of globalism is a worldwide phenomenon. And, the interaction of Parasite in the US is kind of an exemplar of that. Okay, we're getting some more questions. Let's see. Oh, these are people sharing their experiences. Here's one who said, I was in Masan at a small college. I had very little interaction with Peace Corps staff. I loved my experience. I was also the only volunteer in Masan for a year and a half. Perhaps our experience depends very much on expectations going into the Peace Corps experience. Comment? Nobody wants to comment. Well, I'll go on. Here's a comment about the difference between the world of Korea at the beginning of the Peace Corps era and the end in the late 1970s. By the end of the run, most of the public health people we worked with in the Pogunsos were professionals, doctors and nurses. So there wasn't much I, for one, could contribute in the area. But I and other volunteers were good public relations. At that time, Americans were still rare in the country. So we created a sensation when we visited patients. We milked the attention for all it was worth. Here's another one. Regarding success, do you see flexibility developing about what constitutes success? Do Do you find through your discussions that such definitions are now less dualistic, binary, linear? I guess that question was directed at me in my comment about parasite. Just getting students in the US to talk about class at all is like pulling teeth. And so I always start my discussion of class by saying, now we all know it's not nice to talk about class in the United States, but there are some places where people do talk about class. I spent some formative years as a teenager in the United Kingdom where people talk about class all the time. So that starts by discussion. Does it make people more flexible? In some ways. I had one student who I'll always remember after we had our discussion. She said, you know, I know exactly what you're talking about. She said, my boyfriend, he's a car mechanic, and people around me keep saying he's not good enough for me. But I love him. And I don't think that's an important consideration. So yeah, you do get flexibility, I think, as people think about these issues.
You know, I mean, if I could just add, maybe I mean, one thing that's always struck me, and we have scholars here that is so fascinating about Korea. Everything's fascinating about Korea is that on the one hand, it's so, by our terms, hierarchical, right? And at the same time, it's so egalitarian. Yeah. And the way those two things coexist is one of the things that's just continued to fascinate me. But I think that's a lot of what you see, you know, in Parasite. And, you know, when we were there in the 60s and the 70s, people would say, oh, I mean, they say, "I Yangban," you know, I'm a Yangban, you're a Yangban, you know, he's a Sangnom. I mean, you're not supposed to say that, you know, nobody says that anymore. I mean, I had to I was going to say upgrade, but update my Korean, right? You know, but underlying that is a very deep resentment of how, you know, fissures have grown in a way that at least I was not aware of in the 70s about kind of the haves and the have-nots. And I you know, it's not a one-off that Parasite focused so much on this. And I agree with Laurel, it's a global phenomenon, but as on a lot of other, I think, global issues, Korea is kind of the canary in the coal mine here, you know, in terms of the intensity in which we see this.
Well, I'll answer that with another anecdote, because I think a deep sense of status differences was true of traditional Korea, or whatever you want to say, pre-modern Korea. And you could still see it in the 1970s in certain places. So there was a lot of equality after the Korean War, when everything was destroyed. There was no rich or poor, everybody was poor, and they were all in it together. But I remember I was walking down a street in Seoul one day in 1977, probably, or maybe it was 1976. And a man strolled down the street. He was a kakjengi, that is, he had the black horsehair hat on, and he had the white turumagi and the leggings and everything. And he was kind of sauntering down the street the way men dressed like that would. Now, at that time, it was very unusual to see someone dressed like that in Seoul. If you went to a more traditional place like Daejeon, you could see quite a few people like that, but not in Seoul. And what really impressed me is there was a young man there, and he scowled at that man and said some rather rude things to him for being so traditionally dressed. And at the time, you know, I was still young and naive, and I was kind of shocked. I thought, now here's this traditional old man maintaining Korean custom, and that man criticizes him for that. And it was only later that I understood that there was a social status dimension to what he was criticizing. So I think some of that goes pretty far back. Let's see if I can, got one more. Oh, here's a comment on language. It says, class is built into the Korean language. How does it manifest itself today? Do people still apply the hierarchical levels of language in daily life?
Definitely. It's built into the Korean language, except I think it's simplified a bit. when I was younger, I was looking forward to having all these fancy honorifics applied to me. I don't hear them so much anymore applied to me. But I started to realize there's a difference between me as a professor and somebody as a student. I'm an old guy talking to a young person. So yeah, you can't speak Korean without being aware of that kind of hierarchy of age, occupation, and gender.
Yeah, it's simplified, but it's still very important. I've just been reading an ethnography dealing with Filipino immigrants or illegal migrants, I guess, undocumented Filipinos in Korea. And there are all of these NGO organizations of Korean activists that deal with them. And the religious ones are quite hierarchical. The pastor runs them and everything. But the ethnographer was quite shocked when she dealt with this particular NGO because they made a habit of using panmal with the Filipino immigrants. Now, panmal is language uninflected for respect. And the comment was, well, okay, for young people to use panmal amongst themselves, that's okay. But for them to use it, because it can mean intimacy, as well as other things. But for a young person to use panmal with an older person was completely inappropriate. And what it did, in effect, was infantilize the Filipinos by treating them as children. So that is an illustration that even though the system's changed and it's simplified, it's still very, very important. And in fact, when I read that ethnography, I was a little bit shocked too. By hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, the levels are still there, but I have to say my experience was, I was surprised when I went back that I mean, you know, you call a taxi driver Sunsang Nim now, you know, you call a lot of women Sunsang Nim. That never happened when we were there in the 60s or 70s. I mean, the language has to some extent, it may be superficial, I think, democratized. I'm sure there's been work done on this, but mothers use chondemal with their children so that they'll hear it back. It's far less authoritarian, if you like, than the kind of language that certainly I was around in the 70s and the 80s, you know, where it was really clear, you know, who was on top and who wasn't.
Any other comments on this issue? Has anybody been to North Korea?
No.
I've been there twice, and my impression, and it's only impression because your itinerary is so controlled, but that Chondaemal is very elaborate and quite alive in North Korea, much more so than in South Korea. Oh, we've got some more. Here's a comment. Perhaps we need to look at our own lack of egalitarianism. Korea has universal health care, but we do not. I just received a COVID-19 care package from Korea. I've received one too. Also, Korea seems to have a much better sense of community. Comment?
We all appreciate that package.
You know, obviously, we were all kind of pleasantly surprised with the COVID-19 package when it came in. And I was even more surprised and somewhat almost embarrassed by how kind they were to us and how they talked about how we came when Korea was poor, and now we've watched the country grow, and we had confidence in Korea in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And they just wanted to really appreciate what we had done. And, you know, I think we all went there for numerous different reasons. But I think Korea has more than rewarded many of us through all just by being Korea and Koreans. And the package was maybe the frosting on the cake, but it's just a tremendous amount of gratitude to the people of Korea as a whole.
Okay, I'll have one more comment, and I think we'll wrap it up tonight. It's a comment from someone who's an expert in Korean literature, and she says, in Parasite, the young woman supervising the poor family's job of folding pizza boxes speaks Panmal to the father of the poor family, even though he's much older than she is. So in that movie, then status differences or class differences were expressed through language, even there. So with that observation, we'll call it a night. And I want to thank all of you for contributing. Don't forget, there's a second edition of this with some other contributors to the volume. And I'm trying to find out when it is. It is on the 17th, is it? Now I've got all my...
I think it's the same time next week, the 17th.
Yeah, same time next week with a different group of contributors to the book. So if you found this one interesting, you should find the other one equally interesting. So with that, we'll sign off and thank you all for coming to this book launch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Got my copy too. It should say United States and Canada, though.
That's great, everybody. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you. Thank you. I hope to see you in person sometime.
Good seeing
I
you.
enjoyed your comment.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you for your support.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So Professor Moon, it seems like your comments generated quite a bit of interest.
They'll have to read the book.